to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy, and I am your host. And today on the podcast, we're going to do something a little bit different. You know, it may come as no surprise that I've read a lot of books about inflation. If you're going to be the inflation guy, you kind of have to read almost everything about inflation that crosses your desk. And actually, when we had our old website, I had a sort of a catalog of just hundreds and hundreds of scholarly works on various aspects of inflation, everything from, how, the history of the original CPI contract idea from 1973 and to, some of the works that I'm going to talk about today and commodities stuff and everything. Today I'm just going to talk about books because I get asked a bunch, what's a good book to read about inflation? And of course the answer isn't just one book. There are lots of good books about inflation. So this episode is going to be sort of a survey of, I've got a pile here on my desk of, half a dozen books or something that I want to talk about. And we'll have the links to them in the show notes. But anyway, before I get into that, we'll do the word from our sponsor and the trivia question, and then we'll launch right into it. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs. Simplify is a manager of alternative ETFs solving today's most pressing portfolio challenges. This includes income solutions like SVOL, yield curve plays like TUA, and 60/40 diversifiers such as CTA. If you are an individual investor or an RIA, you will likely find that something they have done addresses a particular problem you have that you didn't know was solvable. Check out their website at simplified.us. That's simplified.us. And you can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplified.us/ETFs. And trivia question. So the trivia question, so last week we had a movie question, and some people liked it. It was an interesting one. And so here's another one from the silver screen. Classic. Okay, in all three Godfather movies, what fruit is associated with an impending death or a near miss, according to the Internet Movie Database? So since there would be debate, I have to actually have a citation here. So according to that, what fruit is associated with an impending death or near miss in the Godfather movies? So, and then one other little item. We have rolled out a new website. I mentioned it at the end of last week's episode, and it might have gotten a little lost, but it's enduringinvestments.com, same website, but we've revamped it, and I'd be really interested if you want to go look, see what you think, and let me know if you have an opinion. I would appreciate it. So anyway, last week's episode was very very specific. If you're not managing an endowment, it might not have been for you. This episode is much more broad-based. If you read and you have any interest in economic history, then you'll likely find something here that I'm going to talk about an interesting read. Certainly, like I said, my bookshelf is filled with various reference tomes on inflation-linked bonds, inflation derivatives. I've actually contributed to a couple of these things. I wrote a chapter on commodities with Bob Greer of PIMCO for one of these books. A lot of them are very, very good. And you've heard about a lot of them, Devil Take the Hindmost, The Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Reminiscences of a Stock Operator, a lot of general trading books and economic history books are outstanding. I want to specifically talk about books that touch on or have as a main theme, inflation and the process of inflation. And you've heard of some of these perhaps, but I warrant you have not probably heard of all of them. I'm going to start with some of the history books because I think it's really important. Of course, obviously we say those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And when it comes to inflation, we've got, a couple thousand years of history on inflation, going back to the history of the Roman denarius, and obviously lots and lots of history of not just inflation but hyperinflation. And the hyperinflationary episodes are, of course, much more exciting. We hopefully have learned enough from these things that episodes of hyperinflation in developed economies with reasonably cognizant central banks are unlikely, but they're still possible. We still see around, in the last couple of decades, we've had inflations in various places in Brazil, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and so actually I don't know if South Africa ever got to actual hyperinflation, but anyway, we have episodes of this still. But even if we're not going to have a hyperinflation in the United States, for example, still understanding where hyperinflation comes from, it's an edge case, and hyperinflation is not it's a different animal from a regular inflation, but a lot of the causes are similar. What causes a hyperinflation and the difference from a regular inflation and how you get from one to the other is you have a complete loss of confidence in the currency. And that's how you get from regular inflation to hyperinflation. Well, how do you get to a complete loss of confidence in the currency? Well, how you get there is by going through a regular inflation and the things which cause a regular inflation. And so the first thing I want to recommend as a book, it's a book that's out of print, but it's out of copyright, and so you can get it for free on the internet. And it's called Fiat Money Inflation in France. And it was the most recent version of this was published in 1933, and it covers the great inflation that happened in the late 1700s in France. And it's a fascinating story. It's a very easy read. It's 60 pages or something like that. And it's more than that, maybe 70 pages. But it's really fascinating about how a government that was also sort of the issuer of the currency, got out of control a little bit by, debasing the currency and backing it with, the church's lands and then seizing the church's lands. And it's a very great soap opera kind of story, actually. But it's a story about a government that starts doing something with the best of intentions, and then things sort of get rolling, and really bad things happen. So it's a great read. It's a real page turner. I recommend it. When we think about, if you mention hyperinflation of the average man on the street today, well, okay, the slightly above average man on the street, and you ask, well, where have we seen hyperinflation? The most common answer you get is going to be Weimar Germany. So, post-war Germany, post-World War I Germany. And there's an excellent book on that particular episode called When Money Dies, and that's by Adam Fergusson. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention for the first book was written by Andrew Dickson White. And part of what was neat about that book, by the way, is that there's a foreword by John Mackey. And John Mackey is not related to Charles Mackey, who wrote Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Charles Mackey was a Scottish, but John Mackey is interesting anyway because he was an American industrialist. Anyway, so that was, let me go back to When Money Dies. And When Money Dies was written by Adam Fergusson, and it's about Weimar Germany. And it's a great read because when we think about Weimar Germany and you think about the stories of people pushing around wheelbarrows full of currency, which really happened. There's actually the cover photo on the book that I have, the version that I have. It shows paper banknotes, in the street, and somebody with a whisk broom sweeping them, in the curb, by the gutter. And it's an actual photo from the time. But so that's what we think of. And so you think that, okay, well, this has something to do with excessive printing of banknotes. And that's true. But the background of how that happened is itself really a fascinating story and much more involved than you would think. The people who, the way this all started, was with some fairly, I guess, honest misunderstandings and mistakes that, again, sort of steamrolled and turned into the hyperinflation. So that's When Money Dies by Adam Fergusson. So that's a very good book. And then also in the history category, two more I'll recommend. One is by Christopher Whalen called Inflated: How Money and Debt Built the American Dream. Now, this book, much more recently written, and it starts with a quote, or rather, I guess, on the overleaf before the table of contents. Whalen has a quote from Hayek, and Hayek being sort of a well-known, I guess, monetarist-ish kind of thinker. But anyway, this book, Inflated, is a great. It covers the U.S. history of money and inflation. And it goes back to, the Bank of the United States and Andrew Jackson and the Panic of 1837 and the Gold Rush, and then comes all the way up to fairly current. And so it's again. So if the first couple of books that I recommended give you a general idea of how hyperinflation happens, Inflated is more about our American experience, and historically how we built our monetary institutions, and where we've made mistakes along the way. So how that's Inflated. And then one more in the history category that I've got in front of me. And of these four, this is probably my least favorite of the four, but it's and of the four, it's probably the one that I agree with least, all of the assertions, but it's by, it's called The Great Inflation and Its Aftermath: The Past and Future of American Affluence. And it's written by Robert J. Samuelson, no relation to Robert Samuelson, who wrote the best-selling textbook of all time, Economics. If you've ever taken an macroeconomics course, you probably studied Samuelson, but it wasn't this Samuelson. So this Samuelson is a columnist for Newsweek and the Washington Post and so on. So The Great Inflation and Its Aftermath is specifically about the sort of the 1970s and the early 1980s. And one of the things that he says that, and one of the things I sort of like about this, and I'm not sure if I can find the quote real quickly flipping through it, but he says something to the effect of, the Fed has made lots and lots of small mistakes over time, but they've only made two really big mistakes, and that was the Great Depression, and the second was the Great Inflation. And that's a fair reading of Federal Reserve history. Anyway, so The Great Inflation and its Aftermath. So whereas the Christopher Whalen book is a survey history of America, American history and American banking history and monetary history and inflation, the Great Inflation and its Aftermath is obviously specifically about the 1970s and early 1980s. So those are four kind of, economic history books that I'd sort of throw out for your consideration. And I've read all of them and I like all of them. A book that I would include, and it's it's not specifically about inflation, but it's about money. But if you're going to read a monetarist, you have to at some point read Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman, the favorite book of his, my favorite book of his, isn't necessarily Free to Choose, although that's a great book. But Money Mischief, I think, gets to the heart of what I do, which is, inflation. it's called Money Mischief: Episodes in Monetary History. I interviewed Milton Friedman back in episode 15 of this podcast, which again is really remarkable since he died many years ago. But Milton Friedman, again, it covers a lot of the history that Whalen covers, but more specifically and obviously from a really high intellectual level. The William, bimetallism and William Jennings Bryan and, the 1873 panic. So a lot of the same sorts of things, but specifically from the monetary, the monetary angle. And in fact, reading that book along with the Whalen book as a kind of companion piece, I think if I was going to teach a course on American inflation history, I would probably use those two books as my main textbooks. So, there's I'm going to include a book here that is mostly wrong, and I will say this is a book that I never quite finished because it's devilishly hard to read. It's just it's not wonderful reading, but it is it's important to understand if you are, I would say if you're an economist and you specialize in inflation, then you should have read Alan Blinder, Asking About Prices, A New Approach to Understanding Price Stickiness. Now, price stickiness is a way of saying that we're Keynesians, and in order to make anything related to Keynesianism work, we have to pretend that there's this weird thing that happens with prices, that they're sticky, and we want to understand why. Now, that's certainly true. Prices are sticky, but you can't rehabilitate Keynesianism just with that assumption. However, this book is, there's a lot of really, really good research in here. This is, studying the phenomenon of how prices change. And I've got a great academic interest in that. When I meet, people at cocktail parties or cross-country dinners or whatever, and I ask them what they do and they tell me what they do, my next question is, tell me how it is you price your product. Okay, you work in a coffee shop. Interestingly, I'm curious, how often do you change your prices? Why do you change your prices? Does the price of coffee beans affect your prices at all, or is it pretty much all labor or, whatever? And I think it's important to understand. If you want to understand inflation, you better understand how people set and change prices. And that's what this whole book is about, or at least as much as I've been able to read. Anyway, it's not just Blinder. It's Alan Blinder, Canerri, Lebow, and Rudd. Asking About Prices, A New Approach to Understanding Price Stickiness. Now, I should say, it says a new approach, but this was published in 1998, so the approach is no longer new, whatever the approach was. So I recommend that. You got to recommend people you disagree with if you're going to, study Keynesianism and attack Keynesianism. You occasionally have to read someone who actually believes in it and see what their excuses are. Okay, I'm just going to cover two more here, and I think I'll leave the fun one kind of for the end. The current one, and I've even mentioned this previously, I think, on the podcast, and it's a very recent, it actually is since COVID, a book by Goodhart and Pradhan called The Great Demographic Reversal, Aging Societies, Waning Inequality, and an Inflation Revival. I think this is an excellent book, and not just because they basically say what I've been saying for a while. They say it in a much better way and support it with lots more data. So it's, the chapter 9 is Why Didn't It Happen in Japan? A Revisionist History of Japan's Evolution. And I deal with this all the time. People say, well, when the society ages, then, you get deflation, because of an aging society. Just look at Japan. And what happened in Japan has nothing to do with the aging society. So these guys are really good. They deal with the demographic issue. And they understand and this is a really important part about demographics. Aging society, when your workforce ages, it's inflationary. It's not disinflationary. It's inflationary for a couple of reasons. One is that old people, particularly once they've retired, represent more of a claim on the goods and services of the society, especially in an aging society because the older people in our society use the most healthcare, and healthcare is very, very intensive in terms. It's what 14% or 20% of our economy now is related in some way to healthcare, and so your aging society starts to have more and more claim on the goods and services, and fewer people actually producing the goods and services. And I guess that's kind of that's the fundamental reason. People tend to focus on the consumption aspect of aging societies, but they sort of miss the fact that it's a shift to the supply curve. Anyway, they handle it very well. The great demographic reversal, they handle it extremely well. And again, they back it up with a lot of data and charts and stuff where I just kind of, argue it and reason it from first principles, but they do it much better than I do. Lastly, I'm going to recommend a work of fiction, and I love this book, and I've recommended it before on my blog, and it's called The Mandibles, A Family, 2029 to 2047. There are a lot of great works of fiction that deal with, a lot of the things that we have ended up actually going through. Atlas Shrugged looks very, very similar to a lot of the stuff that's going on today. But what's interesting, so generally when authors write about inflation, they just totally screw it up. And they get the causes wrong and they get the effects wrong, and it doesn't really work, and it's not really believable. Lionel Shriver wrote this book, The Mandibles, A Family, 2029, 2047. And it's chilling because there's no part of it, there's no step in it, in the story where you say, well, that couldn't happen. Every single step is completely believable, really could happen. Some of them have happened. And the effects that she discusses, that she posits, do in fact follow from the causes. In other words, she gets the causes and effects of inflation right, but moreover puts it in the context of what your life would be like and how it would change your life. And so we can sort of sit here and say, talk sterilely about inflation and how it means rise in prices and it's going to be harder to make ends meet and wages, blah, 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 blah. And how would, 2% inflation turn into 5% inflation, turn into 10% inflation, turn into something really bad. But putting it in the context of an actual family, the Mandibles are a family, and taking them through this 20-year period, or this 18-year period covered by the book, is really brings it home. And it's a great read, a very easy read. I actually read it. I listened to the Audible book, audiobook, and it was outstanding. So I highly recommend that. Again, all these things I'm going to link in the show notes. So if you have any interest, and if you do get around to reading any of these, and have a comment, then please you can either comment on the podcast post or just send me a note. I think all of these are reasonably enjoyable, except for the blinder one, which again is probably just plain necessary. And not to all of you. There are a few of you out there, and you probably know who you are, and you probably are saying to yourself, "Darn it, I should read that." But the rest of them are actually fairly entertaining. Now, there are many, many other books out there about money and gold and how different sorts of money over the years and about how this affects markets and trading and so on and so forth. again, I've got a whole shelf full of these things. These are the ones that I pulled off the shelf as being sort of my go-to. If somebody said list your top, 8 or 10, these are what I would recommend. And I hope that you enjoy them as well. Anyway, that's all for today. And so let's go back to the trivia question, which was about the movies, Godfather movies. The question was, what fruit is associated with an impending death or near miss, according to the Internet Movie Database? And the answer is oranges. So they give, there's two examples here. Don Corleone was shopping for oranges when an assassination attempt was made on him. When he actually dies, the Don Corleone actually dies, he is in fact eating an orange. So for some reason, oranges are associated with impending death or the near miss. No idea why, but I love symbolism, so I thought that was sort of interesting. Again, if you get a chance, visit the new website at Enduring Investments and take a look and see and tell me what you think. And other than that, that's all for today's podcast. Please hit that like button on your podcast. Refer other people. Go and read the blog. The blog is up. Got well over 1,000 subscribers now, and that's at inflationguy.blog. And follow me on Twitter at @inflation_guy, and visit Enduring Investments, that fresh new website, if you have an inflation challenge. But most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know about it.